Hey, language lovers out there. Welcome to another deep dive. This time we're tackling the work of Noam Chomsky and his revolutionary ideas about language.
Yeah, we're going to be looking at excerpts from his book, Language and Mind.
So I guess first off, for someone who maybe isn't familiar with Chomsky,
Right.
can we kind of start with the basics?
Sure. So Chomsky is a linguist, philosopher, cognitive scientist, political activist.
Wow, that's a lot of hats to wear.
He wears a lot of hats.
Yeah.
But he's probably best known for his work on language.
Okay.
And his theories have really revolutionized the way that we think about language and the mind.
And he's been pretty influential for a pretty long time, right? Like this isn't just some flash in the pan kind of...
He's been influential since the mid-20th century, so yeah, a long time.
Okay.
And his work is still relevant today.
And his ideas are still being debated and discussed and...
Absolutely.
Yeah.
He's a very controversial figure, but you can't deny his influence.
So what's the big idea here? What makes Chomsky's view of language so different?
So basically, Chomsky argues that our brains are hardwired for language.
Okay.
We're not just born as blank slates.
Okay.
We actually come pre-equipped with this sort of blueprint for language.
Okay, so it's not just like we learn everything from scratch.
Right.
There's something already there.
Exactly. And he calls this blueprint universal grammar.
Universal grammar. Okay. Or UG for short.
So this UG is like the foundation for all languages.
That's the idea. It's like a set of fundamental principles that are shared by all human languages.
So even though languages sound and look different on the surface, deep down there's this shared structure.
Precisely. And this idea has huge implications for how we understand language learning.
Okay, I'm already starting to see why this is so revolutionary. Like, it challenges a lot of our assumptions about how language works.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And one of the key pieces of evidence for this is the fact that children acquire language so quickly and effortlessly.
Right.
You know, they hear a relatively small number of sentences.
But they quickly grasp these complex grammatical rules and start producing sentences they've never heard before.
It's like they're cracking a code or something.
Exactly. And Chomsky points out that this would be impossible if we were simply learning language through imitation and reinforcement.
So there has to be something more going on, like some innate capacity for language.
Right. And he calls this the poverty of the stimulus argument.
Poverty of the stimulus.
Meaning that the linguistic input that children receive is simply not rich enough to account for the complexity of the language that they acquire.
It's like saying you can't build a skyscraper with just a handful of bricks.
Exactly. You need a blueprint.
You need some kind of plan.
Right. And that blueprint is universal grammar.
Okay, so we've got this universal grammar, this blueprint for language.
Right.
But languages still look and sound very different on the surface.
They do. And that's where another key idea comes in, the distinction between deep structure and surface structure.
Deep structure and surface structure. Okay, I think I've heard of those terms before, but can you kind of remind me what they mean?
Sure. So imagine you're looking at a beautifully crafted sculpture.
Okay.
On the surface, you see the shape, the form, the details.
Right.
But underlying that surface is a deeper structure, the framework that gives the sculpture its strength and meaning.
Okay, I like that analogy.
Okay.
So you're saying that sentences also have this kind of hidden structure beneath the words we actually hear or see.
Exactly. The surface structure is the way a sentence appears. The words in a particular order.
Right.
But the deep structure is the underlying meaning, the relationships between words and phrases that give the sentence its true significance.
So it's not just about the words themselves, it's about the underlying relationships between them.
Precisely. And Chomsky argued that our brains use a set of rules called transformations to convert these deep structures into surface structures.
Transformation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like our brains are constantly performing these linguistic gymnastics, shifting and rearranging elements to create grammatically correct sentences.
Okay, so it's not just about stringing words together randomly. There's this hidden logic, this system of transformations that guides how we construct sentences.
Exactly. And these transformations are deeply connected to what Chomsky calls the creative aspect of language.
The creative aspect of language.
Right. Think about it. We can produce and understand an infinite number of sentences, even ones we've never heard before.
Yeah, that's true. We don't just parrot back phrases we've heard before.
Right. And this creativity is possible because we have this internalized system, this universal grammar that allows us to manipulate language in a rule-governed way.
So even in the simplest act of speaking, our brains are engaged in this complex dance of deep structures, transformations, and surface structures.
It's pretty amazing, isn't it?
Yeah. It really makes you appreciate the power of language and the complexity of the human mind.
Absolutely. And while there's still much that we don't know about how language works,
Right.
Chomsky's work has provided a framework for asking the right questions.
It's like he's given us a new lens through which to view language.
Exactly. And it's a lens that has had a profound impact on fields like linguistics, psychology, cognitive science, and even philosophy.
This is fascinating stuff, but I feel like we've just scratched the surface here.
Oh, we've barely begun to dive deep.
So much more to explore.
There is a lot more to explore in Chomsky's work.
All right. Well, I am ready to keep going.
Let's do it.
Yeah.
All right. So we've talked about these big ideas of universal grammar, deep structure, and surface structure transformations.
Yeah, a lot to unpack there.
Definitely. But, I think it helps to look at some specific examples to really see how these concepts play out in actual language use.
I think that would be super helpful.
Okay. So let's start with something called garden path sentences.
Garden path sentences.
Yeah. These are sentences that are grammatically correct,
Okay.
but they kind of trick your brain into initially interpreting them one way,
Okay.
and then you suddenly realize that you've been led down the wrong path.
Okay. I think I know what you mean. Like those sentences where you think you're going one way and then bam,
Yeah.
the meaning takes a sharp turn.
Exactly. And Chomsky was really fascinated by these garden path sentences because he saw them as evidence for the idea that our brains are constantly parsing sentences based on these underlying structures.
So it's not just about the words themselves. It's about these hidden relationships between them.
Right. And a classic example of a garden path sentence is this. The horse raced past the barn fell.
The horse raced past the barn fell.
Try reading it again.
The horse raced past the barn fell. Okay, so at first I was picturing a horse racing past a barn.
Right.
But then fell. What fell?
Exactly. Because initially you parse the sentence as the horse raced past the barn.
Right.
Making you think that's the main clause.
Right.
But then you hit fell and it throws you off.
Yeah, it's like there's a missing piece or something.
And that's because your brain is expecting a certain kind of structure based on the rules of universal grammar.
Okay. So even though the sentence is grammatically correct, it violates our expectations about how sentences should be structured.
Exactly. And if we were to break down the sentence grammatically, we would see that raced past the barn is actually a reduced relative clause modifying horse.
Okay, so the full sentence would be like, the horse that was raced past the barn fell.
Precisely. But our brains tend to go for the simpler interpretation first, which leads us down the garden path.
Okay, so garden path sentences are a cool example of how our brains use these underlying structures to process language.
Exactly. They show that we're not just processing words in a linear fashion. We're parsing these hierarchical structures, these relationships between phrases.
Right, it's like our brains are these mini linguists, constantly analyzing sentences and trying to make sense of them.
That's a great way to put it. And another principle that Chomsky explored that highlights this is the A over A principle.
A over A principle. I don't think I've heard of that one.
It's a bit of a mouthful, but basically it's a constraint on how we can move or extract elements within a sentence.
Okay.
So let's say you want to ask someone about the book they're reading.
Okay.
You could say, "What book are you reading?" That's perfectly grammatical.
Makes sense.
But now let's say you want to ask about the book someone else recommended to them.
Okay.
You might try to say, "What book did they recommend that you read?"
What book did they recommend that you read?
And while that sentence is understandable, it sounds a bit clunky, doesn't it?
It does. Yeah, like there's something a little off about it.
Right. And that's because we're running into the A over A principle.
Okay. I'm still not quite sure I understand what that means, though.
So in this case, we're trying to extract what book from the larger phrase that you read.
Okay.
But this phrase is embedded within a structure introduced by the verb recommend.
Right.
And the A over A principle basically says that you can't extract a phrase of a certain category from a larger phrase of the same category if it's embedded within the specific type of structure.
It's like there are these invisible boundaries within sentences that dictate how we can move or extract certain elements.
Exactly. And these boundaries aren't arbitrary. They reflect these deeper principles of grammar that are at play in all human languages.
So even though most of us aren't consciously aware of the A over A principle,
Right.
our brains are still using it to guide our language production and comprehension.
Exactly. It's like this hidden code that our brains are constantly deciphering and manipulating.
So it's not just about stringing words together randomly. There's this underlying logic, this system of rules that governs how we use language.
Precisely. And these rules are deeply connected to the idea of universal grammar.
Wow, this is blowing my mind. It really makes you realize how much is happening beneath the surface of our everyday language use.
It's pretty incredible, isn't it?
Yeah.
And this is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the complexity and richness of human language.
All right, well, I am ready to dive deeper.
Let's do it.
So we've been talking about all these fascinating ideas about universal grammar, deep structure, surface structure, and transformations.
Right, a lot of really heady stuff.
Yeah. It really makes you realize how much is going on beneath the surface of our everyday language use.
Absolutely. And it's not just about the technical aspects of language. Chomsky's work also has some really profound philosophical implications.
Okay, now you've got my attention. What kind of philosophical implications are we talking about here?
Well, one of the biggest implications is that it challenges the traditional empiricist view of knowledge.
Empiricism. Remind me what that is again.
So empiricism basically argues that all knowledge comes from experience.
Okay,
That our minds are essentially blank slates at birth.
right, tabula rasa.
Exactly. And then we learn everything through our senses, through our interactions with the world.
Okay, so how does Chomsky's work challenge that view?
Well, if we're born with this innate blueprint for language, as Chomsky suggests,
Right.
doesn't that mean that we come pre-equipped with certain kinds of knowledge?
That's a really interesting point. It's like the nature versus nurture debate taken to a whole new level.
Exactly. And Chomsky argues that the complexity and abstractness of language simply can't be explained by experience alone.
Okay, I can see that. It's not like babies are sitting around taking grammar lessons.
Right. They're picking up language incredibly quickly and effortlessly,
Yeah.
despite the limited and often imperfect linguistic input that they receive.
Right, like they're not always hearing perfectly formed grammatical sentences.
Exactly. And yet they're still able to generalize grammatical rules, create novel sentences, understand sentences they've never heard before.
Yeah. It's pretty remarkable when you think about it.
It really is. And this strongly suggests that there must be some pre-existing mental framework. There's some innate knowledge guiding this process.
So it's not just a blank slate. It's more like our brains come preloaded with certain software.
That's a great analogy. It's like we're born with a kind of linguistic intuition.
Right, a sense of what sounds right and what doesn't.
Exactly. Even if we can't articulate those rules consciously.
So does that mean that we're not really learning language in the traditional sense?
Well, it's more like we're uncovering or activating knowledge that's already there.
Okay, so it's not just about absorbing information from the outside. It's about this interplay between our innate capabilities and our experiences.
Exactly. And this has profound implications for how we think about learning and education in general.
Yeah, if we accept that some knowledge is innate, it changes our understanding of what's possible in terms of human potential.
Absolutely. It suggests that we're not just passive recipients of information,
Right.
but active constructors of knowledge guided by these innate cognitive structures.
It's like our brains aren't blank slates, but rather intricate gardens already seeded with the potential to blossom in certain ways.
I love that analogy. It captures the essence of what Chomsky is getting at.
And this idea of innate knowledge isn't limited to language, right?
Yeah. It raises questions about the nature of human thought consciousness and even the nature of reality itself.
Whoa, this is getting deep.
It is. It's getting very philosophical. But that's one of the things that makes Chomsky's work so fascinating.
Yeah, it's not just about the technical details of language.
Right.
It's about these bigger questions about what it means to be human.
Exactly. And that's why his work has been so influential across so many different disciplines.
Yeah, I can see that. It's really sparked a lot of debate and discussion.
It has, and it continues to do so to this day.
Well, I think it's safe to say that our brains are a bit more linguistically savvy after this deep dive into Chomsky's world.
I hope so.
We've journeyed from robin songs to complex sentence structures, from abstract grammatical principles to the very nature of knowledge itself.
It's been quite a journey.
It has. And I think Chomsky would probably agree that there's still so much more to explore.
Absolutely. The study of language is an ongoing process.
Right. There are always new discoveries to be made.
And new questions to be asked.
So keep those linguistic gears turned out there, folks.
Keep questioning those assumptions about how language works.
And keep exploring the amazing complexities of this uniquely human faculty.
Until next time, happy diving.